But we're starting first with a look at Judge Keith's legacy. He's remembered as a judge who never shied away from making the difficult decisions and protecting people's rights. He was the grandson of slaves, presided over landmark cases which included ordering the Nixon administration to stop wiretapping without court orders and desegregating public schools in Pontiac with busing. Stephen Henderson had a great conversation with him about 5 years ago on American Black Journal. We thought it would be a good opportunity to hear from Judge Keith himself about sitting on the bench and making the tough decisions.
I was appointed in 1967 by Lyndon Johnson and by President Lyndon Johnson. And I had been in practice with my firm, Keith, Conyers, Brown, Anderson, and Wall. And we had moved from the Tobin building where all the black lawyers practiced to the Guardian building. And I was co-chairman of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission with Judge Fikens. And I was just delighted when Senator Hart recommended me to President Lyndon Johnson. And
Sure.
My wife Rachel wondered how I would make the transition after practicing law for 17 years and thereabout to being a judge. And it was a little difficult at the beginning,
Yeah.
making decisions and not becoming an advocate, but being open-minded
Right.
about those who appear before you.
Right. Right. And I think that's sort of the hallmark of your career, right? I mean, you've been a very straight shooter from the bench, hard on both sides when necessary, but always fair.
I've tried to be. I've been on the bench for 40 years or so, and I've never held anyone in contempt of court, and I've never threatened to hold anyone in contempt of court. I've tried to be fair. I tried Tony Giacalone, who was the alleged head of the mafia here in Michigan, and it was on a net worth case that the government had indicted him, saying that he was spending more money than he was
reporting.
Right,
I remember that.
You remember that case? So I tried him for 8 months, and he was convicted, and I sentenced him to jail for 10 years. But the interesting thing there was, well, there were a lot of interesting things, but they asked some of the jurors, how difficult was it for you to find Tony Giacalone guilty of these charges? And to my amazement, it's in the paper that they said we tried to be as fair the 8 months trial as Judge Keith was in making our decisions. So that made me feel good.
But they picked up on how fair you were being.
Yeah, because the judge really sets the tone, Steve, of a trial.
Right, right.
Another instance, but just showing you how you can set the tone. I was trying a very radical man when I was on the district court, and his lawyer said, "Now, Judge Keith, this man will not stand up when they say, 'Hear ye, hear, the court's in session.' And he won't stand up when you're in it." I said, "We don't have any confrontation. Let him stay out in the hall, and we'll come out and start."
He can come in when.
Yeah. And then before we take a recess, let him go out. I said, "We don't have to have a confrontation."
Right, right.
And that's where it was.
Yeah, and yet the title of your book calls you a crusader, and that's one of the things that you're very comfortable with that word, right?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Steve, I went to Howard University Law School and had a chance to be with Charlie Houston and Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, and other great advocates. And Thurgood used to tell us, the white man wrote those words, equal justice under law.
Right.
When you leave this law school, I want you to make him live up to those things. Use the law as a means for social change.
Right.
And in my career, I have tried to do that, to try to balance the scales of justice.
Well, let's bring in Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson of WDET and American Black Journal. Hey, guys. The news of Judge Keith's passing, I mean, and to see the tributes that have come out from around the country really has been amazing to see.
Yeah. I mean, this was somebody whose incredible courage and unswerving commitment to the idea of civil rights for everybody, but especially for African Americans, was just, I mean, recognized everywhere. And he was one of the most decent men you would ever meet. I mean, even if he really vehemently disagreed with you, Judge Keith could find a way to find commonality, to be able to talk with you about things, or to make you not feel less than him in any context. And I think that's a lot of what you're hearing from people now, is sort of reflecting that feeling that he had. It's not just the things that he did, it's the way he did them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've had 2 nicknames in my life. My dad called me Pete for reasons I still don't know. No, all my life though. And Judge Keith called me Bubba. I had written a column when I first came into this job in 2000. It was a tail end of the Clinton administration. I wrote a column about Bill Clinton and why people forgave him so much. And I said, it's because he's a Bubba. And everybody's got one in their family and everybody loves him. And he called me right away and said, I'm a Bubba. And from there on, anytime he'd call, he'd say, hey, Bubba, it's Judge Bubba. And he never called me anything else. I mean, he was just that sort of guy who could connect with you. And, you know, I talked to him last week after John Woolman, our publisher, died. He called in and very expressing his sympathy and his, you know, his talking about his friendship with John. I mean, he was just a guy who connected with everyone.
You know, I think it's interesting too, and you talk about some of the cases that he handled, landmark cases that he handled, but then, you know, really his home here in the city of Detroit. Stephen, how would you kind of describe what he has meant to the city in terms of setting that bar? Both of you have talked about leadership. Yeah,
so whenever I would see Judge Keith, he would always bring up his relationship with my grandfather, William Beckham Sr., who was a UAW official. And he would tell me these stories about the work that they did together in the early 60s, the late 50s, early 60s, all the way through the 60s, sort of setting the table, I guess, is what you would say, for that next generation of African Americans. I mean, they grew up in a time in this city when there weren't opportunities for black people to do the things that you see them doing now. They grew up at a time when there were all kinds of barriers, and he was always telling me about how important it was that I was here in the city, and that those of us who are other descendants of those folks are here, sort of taking advantage of all of those things now. Like, my life in the city as an African American man in this century is shaped in a lot of ways by the things that Judge Keith and my grandfather and John Conyers and all kinds of other folks who were here in that time, the things that they did, the way that they responded to the '67 uprising. He would talk about that all the time, getting seats at the table for people to make things better. The way they responded to, or the way they helped bring Dr. King here in 1963 to give his I Have a Dream speech here before Washington. There were all of these moments that they all just sort of coalesced around, and the idea was create something for me, create something for people like me in this city that we all really enjoy right now.
I think we feel like we're seeing this generational change in leadership now, Nolan. I mean, with the passing of people like John Dingell, Damon Keith, how would you describe what their leadership style is in that generation compared to where we are today, and what influence they're having on the next generation of leaders?
Well, they believed, and Judge Keith in particular, believed you can work within to change, to make change. You didn't have to tear things down. He believed and was passionate about the U.S. Constitution, even though the promise of that document was denied to his people for so long. He still saw that as the route to equality, the route to freedom. He believed in the document, even though it wasn't always applied as it should have been. And he took that document, he waved it in the face of America and says, you have to honor this. And I think that was the message throughout his career. The 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, plaques all over the country bear Damon Keith's name. When they're hung in courthouses all over the country, it's Damon Keith's name on that document, because he believed in it and he fought so hard to make its promise universal.
So what does the next generation of leaders look to from Judge Keith's legacy here in the city?
So, I mean, there are some important outposts of his legacy already in place. The Keith Center at Wayne Law is one of the really great examples of that. I talked with Peter Hammer this week, who runs that, and he talked about how they have already been, they've not been preparing for the judge to die, but have been building toward the idea that, the legacy is theirs now, and that it's not just about honoring what he did, but pushing forward on the things that matter now, the barriers that still exist, the structural racism that still holds people back, the inequality that we see sort of across the board, not just here in Detroit, but around the country. They are that sort of leading edge of that legacy now, and it's moving forward. It's not looking back in sort of just honor of the judge. It's saying, here's what the future needs to look like.
And he came to work every day. Last week, 3 days in the office.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
He wouldn't retire.
It's amazing.
Kept working.
Yeah, it's amazing work ethic, and people will be celebrating his life over the next couple of weeks. Thanks, you guys, for sharing a lot of your feelings there. And I'm going to call you Pete, I think, from now on.
That's your name now.
Don't do that to me.
I always answered.
Isn't that so funny? This is we need to get into deeper in this one.